Buenas tardes. Mi nombre es Alberto Manguel, soy el director de la Biblioteca Nacional. Es un placer enorme presentarles a Chandrahas Choudhury. Pronuncio su nombre mal. Uno de los propósitos de los programas culturales de la biblioteca es abrir la biblioteca al mundo. La idea de Borges de una biblioteca universal la entendemos como un diálogo con otras lenguas y otras culturas. El subcontinente de la India, porque es mucho más que un país, son muchas lenguas y muchas culturas. Y nosotros no conocemos casi nada de ellas. En algún caso, algún autor traducido del inglés nos llega, pero las docenas de otras lenguas en las que se escriben esas otras literaturas no son desconocidas. Victoria Ocampo nos introdujo, por ejemplo, a la obra de Rabindranath Tagore, y luego hemos conocido a algunos autores más cercanos a nosotros. Yo conocí a Chandrahas cuando me invitaron al Festival de Jaipur, que es uno de los festivales más grandes del mundo, inmenso. Uno ve no una sala con unas pocas personas, sino realmente un mar de gente. Y no estoy usando una imagen superlativa, es realmente un mar, son miles y miles de personas que se extienden hasta el horizonte. Y allí Chandrahas me entrevistó y descubrí un dialogante enormemente inteligente, con un conocimiento no solo, obviamente, de la literatura de la India y del continente asiático, sino un profundo conocimiento de la literatura europea, americana, sudamericana. Entonces, la conversación que tuvimos en el festival se extendió a muchas otras y leí algunos de los libros que Chandrahas escribió, entre ellos uno que se publicó en España con el título, creo que El hombre pequeño de Bombay, que es una suerte de picaresca maravillosa que les recomiendo fuertemente. La novela que va a salir ahora es Nubes y espero que lo sigan traduciendo al castellano. Ahora bien, esta noche Chandrahas nos va a hablar de algunos de los autores más representativos de esa multiplicidad de literaturas que es la India. Nos va a hablar en inglés. Ustedes tienen el texto de su conferencia en castellano y después de su charla, si tienen preguntas, las pueden hacer naturalmente en castellano y yo se las voy a traducir. Entonces los dejo con Chandrahas Choudhury. Chandrahas.
Thank you very much, Alberto, and thank you to you all for coming tonight. Before I start, I must apologize for my almost non-existent Spanish. I know that, I've read a lot of Spanish writers, but when they have been, somebody else has put them into English translation. And because I did not want to lose you tonight from my English position, I very kindly, Alberto and Ezekiel arranged to have some sort of translation of the material that I'm going to present to you, so that one, there is something that you can take away permanently, and if you think I'm wrong, then you can even say that, like, this was, I said stuff which is incorrect. And two, I felt it would be useful, we both come from very big languages, and sometimes there can be misunderstandings when big powers clash. So finally, if you find me speaking too fast, I was telling Alberto a little earlier that because there's 1.25 billion Indians it looks like a very large country on the map, but once all of us are there, it's quite small. And so we all, in order to be heard, we must speak very fast, because if you stop for even a second, then somebody else begins to speak, which I know is not the case here, but my habits are now 37 years old, and it's very hard to change. So if you find me speaking too fast, please just raise a hand and I will slow down. Even history is a kind of story. Of course, a story with certain rules and with a certain respect for facts. And what I'm going to describe for you tonight is a kind of history of the Indian novel. Thankfully, it is much younger than India, so we are able to track its progress and its past. A history of the Indian novel as it thinks about history itself. So a kind of a history of a history in a way. Many visitors have been coming to India for the last 2,000 years, but about 150 years ago, a very strange visitor arrived without a face, but with a very powerful voice. And the name of this visitor was the novel. The novel came to India as a result of British colonialism, and as with all kinds of colonialism, although the larger power wants to control how its culture is presented to a smaller power, many inadvertent connections occur, and sometimes people of the colonies learn how to use the power against the colonizer. So sometime in the 1840s, 1850s, the British started to create an Indian civil service, and for that they needed people educated in English. And once young Indians were educated in English and went to universities, they also started reading what the British were reading at the time. And so slowly, by imperceptible degrees, the novel began to... India, of course, had many different kinds of storytelling forms. So it's not as if India did not have stories or did not have prose. But there's something very particular about the novel. And what happens now is that, in Europe, the novel had already had its own story for 300 years. All the way, it had its own journey, its own set of meanings, all the way down from Cervantes, across Fielding, Sterne, Diderot, down to Dickens. But, of course, Indians didn't know any of this when they first began to read. And in fact, a very interesting alternative story could be written. What if India had been colonized by Russia rather than Britain, and we'd been reading Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, and Chekhov rather than Walter Scott and George Eliot. But the novel created something of a surprise in India, because we were not expecting this kind of story. And when it arrived in a world, of very distant from any readership in the West. It was a world of child marriage, of caste hierarchies. The novel presumes the particularity of the individual, but in India it was not thought. In most of Indian society, it was not thought that the individual was anything very important. It was more necessary to keep up the old forms of life, and people thought of the personality not so much as an authentic or essential self, but almost like as a mask. You played the role of life, and then you moved on to whatever else was kept up for you. So obviously this created a kind of dissonance between the literary form and the society in which it had suddenly been introduced. And part of this dissonance is part of the reason why Indians, when they started writing novels, began to do such exciting work with it, because as we know, it's when we are uncomfortable that we start to think creatively. And very soon, the first Indian novel was written, and it's extremely strange, but the first Indian novel was written not in any Indian language, but in English. There was a young civil servant called Bankim Chandra Chatterjee who, after having read a lot of novels and realizing he really enjoyed this kind of work, wrote a book, but his mind was so taken up by the all that he had just written in English, that he didn't write in Bengali, which was his mother tongue, but he thought novels kind of have to be written in English. They are in English form. And if you want, Bankim Chandra has been translated into Spanish, I know. We checked this morning, Ezekiel, Alberto, and me, in the archives of the library. And he wrote a very strange book called Rajmohan's Wife in English. And when you read it today, it looks just like the British English of the novelists of the day. So in a way, it was a very effective act of imitation. And although its literary value is small, there's already something interesting about the novel from its very birth in India. If, for instance, I mean, I did not get any passages from it, but if you take the title, Rajmohan's Wife, there's one person who's named in it, Rajmohan. It's in India, everybody knows it's a man's name. So in a way, you know, in every society, traditional society, men have the power. And here it looks like here is a man writing about a man. In a way, the novel is reproducing the power structures of the society that it's describing. But if you think about it again, the title is Rajmohan's Wife, and the stress falls on the second word. The book is about his wife. She's identified because she's married to Rajmohan, but the story is about her. And when you read the story, something very interesting is going on in it. Rajmohan, it turns out, the man of the title, is somebody who is completely unworthy. He has done nothing of interest, and his parents have married him off to a very bright girl. And all he does is sit around all day long and drink and waste his time while his wife cooks, does the dishes, takes care of the house. And at some point in the story, Rajmohan's wife is doing her work as usual while Rajmohan sleeps, and she hears some people whispering somewhere very secretly. And she realizes that some people are planning to make a robbery in the village that night and to steal all the gold belonging to one of the richer people in the village. So a theft is being planned. And it's already evening, so they're just about to go and do it. There's not much time left. And so she goes, she wants to stop this from happening, so she goes running to her husband and says, please wake up. I mean, like, please go and tell them that something's going to happen. They will be able to defend themselves. And he's very drunk, and he says, well, don't bother me, I can't. And so she's in a kind of crisis now, because she does want to stop this from happening, but it's night already, and women in villages never went out at night. And so she thinks a lot, and then she decides she has to go by herself. And then arrives, I think, the first great scene in the history of the Indian novel, in the very first Indian novel. Rajmohan's wife goes running out at night, but the house she's going to is 2 or 3, like, it's not close by. It's a short walk. And as she passes the village pond, she remembers that her parents always told her there are many ghosts over here. And she has to, like, it's a huge crisis for her. Like, she stops and is about to turn back home. And in her head, she's thinking about the ghosts on one side and society and what is going to happen that night, the present on the other, the secular world and the world of imagination and fantasy. And when you read it today, you realize that this scene written in the European novel would not have meant anything very exciting. But here, it is the first time as an adult person that she has gone out at night. You know, the thing that we associate so much with women's freedom today, the ability to go where you please. In this novel, we see that, like, she has never, in all her life, gone out after dusk when the light is gone, because everybody controlled her and said, you know, you have to stay at home. This is not the time for women. Men go out at night, women stay in. And in the first Indian novel, we have a revolutionary scene. And what we need to think of now is, imagine the novel was not very popular, obviously, because it was written in English, and many Indian readers could not read it. But anybody who did, and any woman who did, would start thinking, wouldn't they? Like, why is there something like that terrible about going out at night? And you start to see, through these very simple scenes, how novels can begin to poke here and there people and make them think in different ways, not necessarily by saying the way a political activist would. You must recognize your rights, these have been given to you by the government, there is a constitution in place, not by that sort of means, by argument, but just by presenting to them a certain kind of story where something happens and that allows, because the person who's living or as part of the story resembles us in so many ways, we kind of begin to live the story with them. And when we are finished with the story, we are, in a way, while we are reading the story, we are not ourselves. We are a combination of our own egos, our own histories, and the character whose journey we are experiencing. And once we have finished, sometimes we cannot return completely to the selves that we were when we began the story. We are kind of a little bit mixed up now. And in this way, novels can begin in very small ways to, although the novel self-identifies as story, it's very interested in history. It's very interested in the life of society that it is describing. And what I want to talk a little bit more about today is precisely this kind of relationship. I'm going to read a little bit just because I wrote out some arguments which are also of use, and then in 5 or 7 minutes, I'm going to return to some passages from Indian novels and we will speak again about stories. It is a universally acknowledged truth that human beings experience their lives as embedded not just in time, but also in history. And to interpret history, they employ a variety of instruments: personal experience, cultural memory, political ideology, even historiography, and sometimes myths and stories themselves. But among these instruments, an especially sophisticated one is the novel. What is so noteworthy about the novel as a lens on history or histories? Why should we go to the novel as a way of understanding the history of modern India or even South Asia? After all, you could say the novel is a kind of minority form. It is as a form of story, let alone history. The novel does not enjoy great currency in India. It is neither an indigenous form, as I just revealed, nor a mass one. Cinema has far greater popular appeal, and old Indian epics and narrative conventions like the Ramayana inform everyday life and moral reasoning much more than any novel. Yet, tonight, I would like to suggest that notwithstanding its native shortcomings, the fact that it is not a mass form, it requires dozens of hours of commitment from the reader or consumer, and for its full enjoyment, it presumes not just literacy, which is still today a big demand in a society like India, where many people are not literate. It presumes not just literacy, but a certain basic education in novelistic conventions. Even so, the novel form possesses certain advantages over other forms of discursive prose, and even other narrative forms, as a lens on history. What are these advantages? What could the novel do that historiography could not? From the very beginnings of the novel in India, and even more powerfully, as soon as it set down roots and some people in India began to read novels, Indian novelists or Indian writers began to realize that they had been given a kind of magic wand, something very new that they could deploy, and it had a certain mystery that nobody could figure out. I'm sure that tonight all of us read novels, and you are very well educated in novels. There's something very peculiarly beautiful about novels, which is that they combine in ways that cannot then be like unthreaded from each other. They combine intellectual and aesthetic power. They're not completely a story, and they're not completely an argument. And thank you, Alberto. They're not completely a story, and they're not completely an argument. When you read a novel, you're introduced to the main character and to the sub-characters. The person builds a picture of a society. I mean, there are very few novels where you just are presented the protagonist. You have to say in a realist novel, even though you know your reader knows this world, the town had a population of 20 million or 5,000, as the case may be. By the river, 3 kinds of families lived and stuff. You have to make a little picture. And the picture is, as soon as in a novel you begin to describe a world, you also kind of interpret it. There's no description in novels that is not also an act of evaluation, of judgment. Therefore, there is something, on the one hand, and also a lot of novels typically, even today, of course you use other tenses for particular reasons, but usually realist novels are written in the past tense. And when you meet characters, imaginary people in the novel, you kind of read their stories as if they already happened. There's something very persuasive about the use of the past tense in making us feel as if we are looking at stuff, and this is the same when you write histories, that something that has already happened, although it never did happen. So despite its apparent transparency, it's important to note the novel is a form that invisibly integrates realism and idealism, always describing and interpreting what is from the implied perspective of that which could or should have been. The most powerful novels, and was true of India right from the very beginning, the most powerful novels interpret reality from a private position that may be tragic or comic, but is usually always politically and socially restless. Compounded from several points of view and requiring an active reader to sift through a thicket of assertions, both sincere and sly, novels could animate rational argument and social critique, ironize and destabilize the simplifications of political rhetoric. And this is why so many intellectuals in India who used to write tracts or pamphlets began to move to novels, because they saw this is a much easier way of getting readers, getting into the brain of readers. All these writers from the very beginning realized that after hundreds and hundreds of years of praying to God, suddenly they had a new power, and that the novelist himself or herself, later herself, not at the very beginning but very soon herself, was a kind of responsible and voluble God who could, even if only within the world of a text, set a recognizable world in motion and ruminate upon his or her creation. She had the freedom to rove in spaces of the past that could not be accessed by means other than that of the imagination as used in the novel. The novel also offered the potential to think about history not in a straight line, but dialectically, in exchanges between characters, or in switches of perspective between the narrator and characters. All this made the space of the novel a particularly fertile ground for historical thinking. Indeed, a preoccupation with Indian history, with the large-scale analysis of where India had been in the past, where it was going as a society, is a thread running through the work of some of the greatest Indian novelists across more than 24 Indian languages and literary traditions. And here, this is an important point because I was in Brazil the last 2.5 months before coming to Argentina yesterday, and as far as I understand, both in Brazil and in Argentina, there's a multiplicity of languages, but there's one major language. In India, this is not really so. Some of you may think Hindi is the language of India, but it's only the language of the Indian North. And in the same way, although a lot of the middle class are educated in English, 500 or 600 million Indians don't speak English at all. And what this has meant something very particularly interesting for the Indian novel, which is that unlike novels in most other parts of the world, nobody in India has a full picture of the history of the Indian novel. You know, there's more than 12 languages in India that each have more than 10 million speakers. So, and of course, it's not possible for any Indian person to learn all the languages of India. So what has happened is that most Indian readers and writers such as myself who are interested in the novel have to keep on finding out, making a larger and larger picture of the Indian novel by reading in translation. But of course, we know that not all great books are translated immediately. Sometimes it takes 100 years. And so, as a result, the picture of the Indian novel becomes bigger and bigger all the time, not just in space, but also in time. In 2006, for instance, there was the first English translation of a very great work from 1902, which once everybody began to read it, they realized that all the histories that had been written of the Indian novel so far were wrong. You could make a new kind of picture, and you had to track back and tear up a lot of the stuff. And I want to speak today about this book in particular as perhaps the first uniquely Indian novel. So Indian not in its content, as in a story about India, but Indian in its form. And that is something very interesting. And that shows, that I think is a sign that a literary form has taken root in a world. When people begin to take their inheritance. Just like a child becomes independent when, after having learned everything from your parents, you first make your own individual act of personality. In the same way, the first Indian novel, the genuinely Indian novel, which came out in 1902, it's called 6 Acres and a Third. And What is very interesting about this book is it tells, in a way, a very traditional Indian story, but in an extremely new way. The story, 6 acres and a third, an acre, you know, is a unit of land. And in India, a lot of great Indian novels are actually about land because in a traditionally feudal and agricultural society, obviously, this is the way in which power is traded, through how much land you own. And even very small farmers or small individuals all like a little plot of land. That's how they feel secure. To this day, so many Indians feel secure when they have like a small plot of land in their village. And the story is a very traditional one. It has been told 100 times in India before. A very large landholder in the village is a very evil, very harsh man. He has been giving out loans to the villagers when they're in debt. And there's a pair of small farmers who have taken a loan from him and they've not been able to pay it back in time. And he wants to go to them and say, your time is up, and I'm going to take your land in compensation, leaving them entirely penniless, after which, you know, they have no future at all. But in his eyes, there's a nice piece of land by the river. He keeps dreaming about it. It's so green, it's so fertile, the rice grows so beautifully there. All he can dream of is this land. But the story is told not from his point of view, but, you know, from traditionally novelistic narration is divided into two basic modes. Third person, where all the characters are he, she, they, and first person, where the voice is I, and usually the I is a character in the story itself. These are the two high and low modes of novelistic narration. But when we open this book, on the very first page, from the very first sentence, the voice being used is we, first person plural. When we saw that the landowner had decided to confiscate the land of these people, and immediately you start feeling a little disoriented. What does this we mean? Because whenever you hear the word we, you kind of include yourself in it. And then we find that something very extraordinary is happening, and a very beautiful effect, but at the beginning it's very troubling. The we voice of the story identifies completely with the person the evil man who's trying to confiscate the land. So from the very beginning, we know that everyone didn't like him at all, but the truth was he was a very humble, a very holy, a very religious man. He really loved his wife and so on. And every time we hear the word we are trying to remove ourselves from this because we can read through it to see that this is not true. And something very interesting is being achieved over there. On the one hand, though, the we is a very good choice because in traditional societies, so much of the decision-making and so much of political power is organized by a kind of chorus of village elders, isn't it? It must be the same in Argentina as well. In traditional village societies, whenever there's a problem, whenever there's a legal matter, you didn't go to court. That's just today. The old people of the village got together and say, we decide that this is the truth of the matter, and we decide that this is what is going to happen. So in a way, Senapati is taking on this old Indian voice that every reader will recognize, but using it in a very unique and novelistic way to actually criticize the very society that the we voice is describing, which is a very unique and beautiful effect. And to me, this is the first Indian novel where the form of the novel is being used as a vehicle of social and political critique. And actually, there are some resemblances between Senapati's style and that of a lot of Latin American writers. In fact, if you want to follow this thread of thinking, you can go to the library, and there's I think, critic in Spanish called Jennifer Harford Vargas, who has written an essay about the resemblances between Senapati's novelistic style and that of Gabriel Garcia Marquez. It's an essay about 100 years of solitude and 6 acres and a third, saying that in societies with very large asymmetries of power, this is a particular way of writing a story, ironic, parodic modes of storytelling. She calls it underground storytelling. You cannot write a very straight-up critique of the structures of power. You have to do something very radically innovative that allows the reader to unpack the truth. The reader unpacks the truth of what is going on. And I'm going to also, but to return to my larger theme of how Indian novels were Indian novelists were using the form to think about history, I'm going to read a little bit about what this book exactly does as a way of showing its readers how to think about history. Senapati's novel revolves around a village landowner's plot to usurp the small landholding of some humble weavers. But this is also the Indian village in the high noon of colonialism. And the first readers of Senapati's story would have been delighted in the narrator's many potshots against new and perplexing British institutions, administered by a new ruling class of English-educated Indians, such as Bankim Chandra, for instance, the writer I spoke about before. Ask a new Babu. A Babu is an Indian English-educated person. Ask a new Babu his grandfather's father's name, and he will hem and haw, the narrator chirps. But the names of the ancestors of England's Charles III will readily roll off his tongue. And there's another beautiful moment in the book where the narrator says, it's because the English are have made such progress in science and technology that they are white-skinned. Because Indians have not many progress at all, that's why we remain dark. Thereby inverting the hierarchy between race and progress in this very unusual way. So generally now we get the point. Like the story, Senapati's story appears to be generating an argument about history and about political resistance. The implied argument is that India must rid itself of its colonial masters because they have delegitimized many of the traditional knowledge systems and truths of India, and in the process made the modern Indian self imitative and inauthentic. This argument persists in India today, and there must be a version of it in Argentina as well. The debate between westernizers and those who think that modernity should take a more indigenous form, and even a third possibility that people should not become modern at all. The traditional way was best. These are the debates of any society, and they are there in this book as well. But while you're reading this book and you see all these jokes being made about the British colonizers, a new question is also raised by this book, by this critique of British rule. Was traditional Indian village society itself very wise, just, or balanced? Was that old we, before this new we, that old we of India, was that something good? And does the narrator, is he trying to say that we should return to that kind of life? As the story progresses, though, we see that the anti-colonial sentiments have not blinded the narrator to the need to subject his own side to the scrutiny of satire. And you can see this every time he talks about Hinduism and Indian religion. For instance, we read at one point that the priest was very highly regarded in the village, particularly by the women. And the goddess frequently appeared to him in his dreams and talked to him about everything. Not just about very important matters, but just about all sorts of gossip of the day, maybe appearing in the heavens. And when he does this, we kind of see that, there's a very uniform satirical eye in Senapati. It's not that he wants to valorize one side over the other. In a way, he's a kind of universal ironist who likes to take pot shots at all kinds of power. And we see, it's a very unusual formation because in India of the time, the debate would, typically people will be divided. Some people will be on one side of the debate against the British and some people will be on the other side. But here is a book, a novel that seems to braid these two perspectives into the same kind of narration. And we realize as readers that Senapati's irony is effective, not despite, but actually because of its double-sidedness. It leads to a point useful as much in our time as his own. And so, across the particulars of the novel, we see something like a method for thinking about history that we can take away to any situation, which is that criticism of a clearly marked out other to Indians in the early 20th century, the British, and to the Hindu nationalists of India today, Muslims and Christians. Criticism of a clearly marked out other often legitimizes a sweeping and complacent faith in one's own worldview. The search for truth or meaning in history must remain a charade, if not accompanied by the capacity for self-criticism. Senapati's novel's implied argument is liberating, not because it is comforting or inspiring, but precisely because it is disenchanted. Fiction itself shows us how human beings are fiction-making creatures and must therefore take special care to scrutinize what they believe to be foundational truths. I'm going to talk a little bit in detail about one other novel that I like very much, and an English version of this exists. Maybe it can be ordered for the Biblioteca Nacional if anybody is interested in reading it. This is a book called, it's written much later, in 1957. Just to fill you in a little bit, in 1947, the British left the Indian subcontinent. But by that time, things had become very polarized, and what used to be undivided India became divided into two new nation states, India and Pakistan. And the event of the time was called partition. At the time, it was the largest mass migration in Indian history, partly because Pakistan was organized on the basis of religion. So many Indian Hindus who used to live in what was now to be Pakistan moved across into what would be the new Indian state, and many Indian Muslims went the other way. Although in both countries, some people also stayed from each religion. And because things got out of control, hundreds of thousands of people were killed on the way. There was many massacres, riots. One of the great Indian novels of the time, Train to Pakistan, is about the people who left one country for the other on a train and arrived dead on the other side, killed by people on the way. However, from these events, Indian novelists again began to write about this, what had just happened, as a way of trying to make sense of what was it about the direction of Indian history and new political history that had led to this. And one of the greatest of these novels is the book I'm going to talk about now. It's called Jhoota Sach, The False Dawn. Because people thought we are now going to be independent, we are going to direct our own future. I mean, every nation's history is full of false dawns, and by studying these false dawns, maybe at some point we can generate a real one. This is the greatest fictional account, not just of that false dawn of partition, where so many people, like the two countries, were born in a river of blood, but also there's two other things that is very beautiful about it. One, it's the greatest, one of the greatest novels ever written about the place of journalism, as a way of ensuring the health of society. That although the writer, Yashpal, is himself a novelist, the protagonist, the main character of the book, is a journalist. And the story is about his attempt to start a newspaper that does not take a partisan point of view, either on the Hindu side or the Muslim side. So it's a very interesting story because, in a way, Jaydev is the name of the hero of the book. And although he believes deeply in journalism and in the power of journalism to reveal the truth and by day to educate the reader in the ways of Indian democracy, he finds that every time he gets a job, they want him to take a certain political and partisan viewpoint, and that whenever he writes something different, he's fired. So in a way, we see already a contradiction at work. Precisely the newspaper, what we go to as for a source of facts and for truth, is what he's dissatisfied by. And Jaydev dreams of, the story begins before partition and moves on into Delhi after partition. So we see it takes place over 20 years, and you meet many, many characters. I'm going to read a bit more, and before I come down to the passage I want to focus on. A different kind of novelistic irony, cosmic in Yashpal's case, rather than comic as in Senapati's case. A different kind of novelistic irony radiates from This Is Not That Dawn. Yashpal's 1,000-page magnum opus from the 1950s about partition. Tracking the lives and loves of a brother and sister across the worlds of Lahore and New Delhi in the years before and after partition, Yashpal's novel generates dozens of alternative views of that cataclysm from viewpoints that are male and female, Hindu and Muslim, Indian and Pakistani, even as these new identities come into being and crystallize, and prospective and retrospective. Here is novelistic history on the grand scale, individual, national, human, all at the same time. Each character's position or dilemma carries its own distinctive charge of hope, memory, conviction, doubt, faith, naivete, prejudice, and fatalism, a vast spectacle of human beings swimming valiantly with and against the tides of history. Most interestingly, though, the narrator's own voice is very, very subdued. If he himself has something to say about the logic or validity of the breaking up of India, it remains parceled out among the characters and must be intuited by the reader. On the other page that you have, there's a passage from this book, which I'm also going to read. Puri is the main character of this book, so he's the character in this passage. There's two people here, Puri and Kanak. Kanak is the girl he's in love with. There's something that happens in the novel, a riot called the Chalk Riot. The Chalk incident was described in the Hindu newspapers as an attack on a peaceful march of Hindus passing through a Muslim neighborhood. The Muslim newspapers reported it to be an unprovoked attack by Hindu mobs on Muslims. There were 18 murders and over 100 people wounded in Lahore on one day. Puri, who has started a new newspaper, knew that besides being the editor and manager of the weekly, he might have to write most of the articles himself for the first few weeks. He has succeeded in starting his newspaper, but he has no staff, so he does all the writing for it himself. He wanted to have good, solid material for the first 4 issues. He desperately felt the need for an assistant, someone who was like-minded and carried the same flame in his heart, someone committed to journalism with enthusiasm to match, who would instinctively know what Puri was thinking and put it flawlessly into language. And they would, between them, turn the weekly into a vibrant voice that would touch the hearts of the people. Kanak shared his dream, but she was not with him when the time had come to turn the dream into reality. Had she been there, they would have worked as one and achieved great new heights. Kanak's dream was to have a house of their own, both of them at their desks, writing and creating. In one of the first great Indian novels after the birth of Indian democracy, we find this extremely unusual view of Indian love and romance, very different from anything in the past, and very different from anything in the great epics. The main character dreams that his wife is a co-partner in starting up a newspaper, and they write the material together. And although she has been left behind in Pakistan, and he does not know where she is. So it is a lost dream, it is a failed dream. And we also see that she also had the same dream, and in a very traditional society, what we see is a female protagonist whose dream is of marriage, of domesticity, is that both partners sit at their desks writing, thinking, and creating. For the readers of the time, it would have this kind of view of the possibilities of female emancipation would have been particularly striking. And I think, and I know for a fact, and we can tell that this is Yashpal's intention, because very unusually in the novel, there's a kind of, one of the great things about novels is that you can many stories can go forward at the same time. And as the book progresses, this character that Puri is in love with, Kanak, she falls out of the story. We don't know what happens to her. And another character appears, his sister, who was always the very quiet person in the family and had never done anything of importance and was married off to somebody. And in the new India after partition, both siblings arrive in Delhi, and what we see is that the hero of the book, Puri, slowly begins to degrade as a person. He starts a newspaper, he becomes quite powerful, people invite him, invite him to big functions, he goes around meeting the rich and powerful of the city. And without knowing it, he himself becomes like one of those people that he previously despised. Somebody who holds a party line and in his newspaper writes the same kind of things that he himself as a younger man would have despised. So the hero of the book becomes somebody that as we read it, we begin to see that he's not to be trusted actually. At the same time, we see his sister who in the partition riots was raped. And she arrives in Delhi as a refugee. The brother and sister don't know that they're both in the same city. And she, completely helpless, lives in a refugee camp with hundreds of other women. And one day, the person who runs the camp realizes that this lady is educated and says, why don't you organize these women so that they come on time, that the clothes are distributed, the blankets and food are distributed. Please take charge because you're educated. And she says, well, I've never done something like that before, but okay, I will. And she begins to do that very well, and then she's given more responsibilities until finally she herself is heading the relief camp. And then somebody says to her, you are very good at this, and she also begins to rise up in the new world of Indian democracy. She's still very attractive, and this is a very interesting charge in the book. Many men fall in love with her and ask her to marry them. And she always refuses and lives alone by herself as she grows older. And again, as a way of presenting an example in Indian history, this is Yashpal's feminism. He himself was a very traditional man, but this again shows in the capacity of novelists to think about truths that are not necessarily their own. As the book ends, we see Puri, her brother, falling further and further down the scales of the book, and his sister rising up further and further up. And in the end, the vision that we take of a future of India where all possibilities can be fulfilled is that of the woman and not that of the man. And this is the large architecture of this book, which makes it such an inspiring and impressive work. My last few points. As these examples show, the work of novels is not confined to a mere representation of historical realities, although this is where they may start. Rather, a novel may be a creative intervention in history in its own right, an actual agent of history, passing on to the reader who passes through its narrative field both its diagnostic and visionary powers. Indeed, from Bibhuti Bhushan Bandyopadhyay to U.R. Anantamurthy, Bankim Chandra Chatterjee to Kiran Nagarkar, Kurutulan Haider to Salma, Phanishwarnath Renu to Amitav Ghosh, Indian novelists have generated some of the most layered and sophisticated visions of Indian history produced in the last 2 centuries, on equal with that of more political thinkers, Gandhi, Nehru, Ambedkar, some of whose names you might know. And in fact, when they are themselves reinserted into the canvas of Indian history, the projects on the one hand of the Indian novel and on the other of Indian democracy, both which are fairly new forms in Indian history, these projects appear uncannily similar. The values of the novel that we typically know, individualism, skepticism, narrative depth, polyphony, truth-telling, seem to be in dialogue with those of democracy. Both these forms invest similar kinds of trust in the individual and take a similarly complex view of the relationship between liberty and responsibility. It's just that democracy works through ideas and arguments, and the novels through stories. As Indian democracy has, over the past 7 decades, sought to fashion a new social contract in a deeply hierarchical civilization, a new egalitarianism, so too the great Indian novel has attempted to not just find, but also to form a new kind of reader or citizen, alive to both the iniquities and also the redemptive potential of Indian history. Thank you very much.
Bueno, muy bien. ¿Alguien tiene una pregunta? Si podemos tener un poco más de luz en la sala, por favor. No, no hay nadie. Bueno.
Alberto, did I speak too fast at some point? I know you were trying to slow me down.
Yes, but bueno, ¿alguien tiene una pregunta? ¿No? No veo, así que por favor digan. Ah, muy bien. Pregunta en castellano y Guillermo, aquí, toma el micrófono.
Antes que nada, muchas gracias por la conferencia. Y la pregunta sería con respecto al cuento corto, si hay alguna huella que se pueda trazar de la tradición de las 1001 noches en la literatura contemporánea.
If I understand you, thank you, sir, for your question. Can I track this short story from in India? Yes. But as you know, in societies where the novel takes root, short stories become part of like a subset of the novel rather than something with its own form. So a lot of Indian writers, when you use the short story today, you use the same conventions much of the time that you would in novels. And of course, there's other kinds of story in the past, fantasy, myth, fable, all these things exist. In fact, I have a book that I edited called India, a Traveler's Literary Companion. It's a kind of introduction to Indian literature, and it has translations from many languages, in which I also tried, it has only short stories, and sometimes a passage from a novel, but many different short pieces. And in that, I tried to represent the diversity of Indian storytelling, from oral mythic forms to realist narrative to fantasy. In fact, my favorite story from the book, which again shows what you can do with the short story, is a story called The Accountant. Somebody who does revenue, taxation, that sort of thing. It's about an accountant in India who leads a very boring life. In the first scene of the story, we see him coming home after work, and he looks at his wife folding clothes. That's how they spend the evening, like doing little things with watching each other. But when he falls asleep in the night, he begins to see these very strange dreams flying back from Delhi out into the Gangetic plain. And he arrives on the banks of the Yamuna River, and he sees a big gap over there. And he realizes that he's on the site of the Taj Mahal in India before it has been built. So, and that he's the king of that place, and like it's his job. No, he's an architect actually, and he's been given the task of building the Taj on this place. And the whole book is about his double life. Both as a very normal human being without any great personality characteristics, and then the life of the dreams at night, where every night he goes back and he has this raging love affair with a girl he discovers on the banks of the Yamuna. So yes, you can. There is a link in India of the short story across far back, much further back to Indian history. But today, I would say the much closer link is between the short story and the novel.
Thank you. ¿Alguna pregunta más?
Is there? You mentioned the various languages that are spoken in India. Are there any novels that are multilingual? And I'm thinking of, say, Junot Diaz, The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde, or even Cormac McCarthy, his Border trilogy, which mixes Spanish and English without translating. Are there multilingual works?
This is a very good question, actually, because you could argue, in a way, that even when a novel is written in one language, it is kind of multilingual. When you write a novel in English, you also write many Englishes, trying to mix, the register of, it must be the same in Spanish, the register of how people of a certain class speak. And so your question is, it becomes harder to mix languages of different kinds because you have to think of the reader. For instance, when I wrote my first book, Arzi the Dwarf, in Spanish, El Pequeño Hey the Bombay. When Indians read it, they can tell that from the names of the characters that somebody comes from Gujarat, somebody comes from Maharashtra, different parts of the country. But they all speak to each other, obviously, in the novel in one language, which is English. And what some writers have tried to do is, in many Indian languages have become Englishized. For instance, nobody says waqt or samay anymore, which are the many Indian words for time. Everybody says time, even in the villages. All the other words are from the language which is they speak, but when it comes to this concept, they all say time. So you could use this method to show certain changes or realities in India if you wanted to focus on that. But do you think, sir, for instance, if you mixed many languages together, of course, if you read someone like Salman Rushdie, what he's doing is mixing Hindi and English in a certain way. But it's always a particular narrative strategy. I don't think the idea is to show the reality of a country just by mixing different words from different. There's a certain aesthetic intention at work. And I also think this method has its limits. I mean, I don't know what you think, Alberto, about mixing in of other kinds of languages, perhaps. But to me, every novelist also both uses a language and invents it above what is given to him. And in some cases, for instance, a lot of where I come from, Mumbai today, it has its own language that does not have a script. and it's the language is a mix of words from other languages, which people from all over have kind of, and everybody who comes for the first time to Bombay says it's such a terrible language because it sounds so ugly. It is ugly because it's a city language made up of like small words, and the grammar is terrible, and everybody speaks extremely fast. So that's why sometimes even I do when I'm not watching myself, because I grew up in Bombay. But when Bombay writers write books about Bombay, where linguistic realism is very important, for some people it is not. Where it's important, they use a lot of these Bombay words, and that is a kind of, representation of a mixing of languages.
Chandrahas, I wonder if in your own work as a novelist, you feel the gravitation of contemporary Indian history. Is that, do you consider that to be one of the elements in your fiction? Does it matter to you? Does it influence your fiction in a direct or...
But all these things, novels are a very good way of thinking about the meaning of these realities, because you can compare present and past in novels. For instance, you could use 2 or 3 generations of a family to think about views of love, as I'm sure you also do in Spanish novels. And in my own work, I've become more and more interested in Indian politics, and where I come from is Orissa, a state on the east coast of India. And when I go back to the villages of my state now, I see many women who have who almost have many of them are illiterate, uneducated, but they stand for elections. And some of them even win, and they succeed in changing a lot of things. And it's quite clear to me that nowhere in the last 2,000 years of Indian history would somebody like that, with that background, have acquired political power. It's only today in the 21st century. And what does that mean for the history of that society when, like, women take charge? So all of these are very new, very interesting. And then what does that do to the rest of society? We shouldn't think that this is something very simple or very easy. Other people are upset. Some people say, how can somebody like that, who used to clean our dishes, now tell me that I cannot throw litter on the street, or that I cannot have 25 servants and not pay them any wages? 3 months ago, before I left for South America, I went to a place which is called the Village of Bonded Labor in Orissa, where until 25 years ago, there were people who, when they were born, their parents are in debt to the landowners, a bit like in that novel. And they had no freedom. They had to work for free their entire life because they had to pay off these debts. They were bonded, they were serfs in a way. And in democratic, independent India, this continued for 30 or 40 years. Very far out in the villages, you cannot control what goes on. So very slowly, but today it would not be allowed. And just in the last 25 or 30 years, all these changes have come into being as a result of working against each other. Something happens here, people hear about it there. And I think novels are very good. Gonzalo, you must, because we both work in the form, we must know to track, or like you write these little stories, and in a way you take the ideas forward also in the same way as journalists do. When you write a story of somebody else reads that story and thinks, can't that also be my story too?
¿Alguna pregunta más? Bueno, thank you, Chandrahas.
Thank you so much for coming.